He was just a man on fire. The more you read about him, you see that he was just determined to make a name for himself.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. This week we're going to talk about Buddy Holly. Now I'm hoping that everybody watching this is saying to themselves, oh, Buddy Holly, what an incredible performer, songwriter, etc. But I know that there are some of you who, you know the name. I'm ruling out any possibility any of you don't know the name. But I know some of you will simply know the name. And as a result, let me do a little bit of updating before we get to what is really the core interest of this program, is to allow us to learn things from people's planning for later life as well as beyond. So a little bit of an overview of Buddy Holly. Some of you will know some of the songs, the hits that he had in the 50s over a very short period of time because he died very young, died at age 22. But he had Peggy Sue as a hit, Oh Boy, Maybe Baby, Rave On, and So It's Easy, among other songs that continued to be hits and became fresh hits after his death. So even though there's this period of time of really a couple years from the moment he started recording up until his death, 57 to 59, he cranks out these hits and he has this huge impact on music. And this is at a transitional stage in the progress, or some would say devolution, of music, moving from what we were doing, say, in the 40s. We had Frank Sinatra, and he kind of led the transition from the big band era more to the crooners. And then in the 50s, there was more of a jazz sort of an upbeat focus in music that took various forms. But that more upbeat effect, you saw it in country music, you saw it in, of course, jazz, but you also saw it in popular music. And then Elvis is coming on the scene by mid-50s and is making waves and having an impact. But the people that we most readily associate with, I guess, rock legends, people like the Beatles, some would say the Rolling Stones, certainly commercially Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, they were trying to figure this out at that stage. So really, Buddy Holly is the person who came ahead of them, who more showed the way, I think, than Elvis. Now, some would say that's unfair. Elvis is huge, and I think Elvis is great. I still listen to his music. I try to tell my kids how great Elvis is, and I just can't sell them on it. But
they just never latched on, huh?
They just don't get it, you know? There was something about Buddy Holly that was really before its time. It wasn't simply that, there were some ways in which Elvis influenced him for sure, but he also introduced a style of writing, and the music was a little more sophisticated. And remember, Elvis was not a songwriter, great performer, but not a songwriter. So when you think of people who wrote and performed songs in this very new, evolving way of the late 50s, Buddy Holly stands out. And then when you throw in the fact that you have to give him some consideration when you think about his importance to the fact that he did this over a 36-month period or so before his death.
I have to wonder if he's one of the shortest charting artists around.
Maybe.
It's got to be up there.
Yeah, I mean, Jim Morrison had substantial longer period of time. Janis Joplin, I mean, both those were short, but they were 5-6 plus years. Jimi Hendrix, he came and went fast, but he may be close, but he didn't have quite the commercial success. Some would say he's more of a legend as a musician than maybe Buddy Holly. And I won't argue that too much. It could be argued, but the point is, Jimi Hendrix also had a short period of time, and it's amazing that people can come along and really influence music for years to come, and definitely Jimi Hendrix did that over such a short period of time. So yeah, there are these people who it's not so much a matter of how much of them we saw, but it's of the value of what they were. And Buddy Holly was one of those. So he went on after his death, of course, to sell many, many more albums. We'll talk a little bit more about that. and songs became hits that were never hits before that he had done. So he was just very influential and credited by the people whose names I mentioned. The Beatles had great things to say about him, as did the Stones, and Bob Dylan has commented on him as well. So, and then there's a group, the Hollies. I didn't know this. Did you know the Hollies were named after Buddy Holly? And
not until today.
yeah, in commemoration of him. So, yeah, I thought the Hollies were great, but I didn't know that connection. Anyway, so this is who we're talking about, somebody who had an incredible impact on music. Many of you will know of it as The Day Music Died, which was Don McLean's song. Is it Don McLean? It's Don McLean.
Don McLean, yeah, American Pie.
When I listen to him on country music, they refer to him as Don McLean, the country DJs. But so he kept, boy, those lyrics are great, aren't they? The Day the Music Died. What an incredible song. It's like he created this great song and it couldn't be repeated in his career. That was it. I mean, he'll be known forever for that song, though he had maybe 2 other hits. Anyway, so here we're going to talk about somebody who was huge, and we wish that the world had had many more years of his music. We wonder, would he have adapted in ways that in the 60s he would have become more countercultural, maybe even more innovative than he was at that time, though he was very innovative in his time. But we'll never know those things. So a little bit of background, now that we set the stage for this person, this very important figure in musical history, 20th century musical history at least. So Buddy Holly grew up in Lubbock, Texas, grew up in a middle-class family, comfortable. His dad was a clothing salesman as well as a tailor, so I guess kind of custom clothes. Had a fairly normal childhood, intact family, had 3 siblings. He was the youngest, Buddy was the youngest. So he developed an interest in music very young. In high school, he was performing every opportunity he got. As a matter of fact, he had the ability to learn to play at least 3 different instruments. He played piano, he played violin, and I don't know how well he played violin. Apparently, he played piano very well. And then at age 12, someone got him a guitar, and he was very good at that, became that at least very soon. You don't see that so much in his performances, but there are people who saw him play who've commented on how talented he was in terms of guitar. So Waylon Jennings is one of those people who I've heard talking about him. Waylon, at the time of Buddy's death, Waylon was the bass player of the band of what was called the Crickets, and he has commented about the musicianship of Buddy Holly. So Buddy was very much somebody who enjoyed being on the stage. And anybody who's seen even clips of him or pictures even of him have probably seen him in a pose that's very expressive on a stage somewhere. So that was his personality. He's bigger than life, just full of energy and dynamism that doubtlessly was a huge factor in his fast rise to commercial success over the period of time that here he dies at age 22. So we're talking about getting to commercial success pretty quickly. And that involving, for the most part, almost exclusively songs that he had written. So to have the ability to write that well that young and make them hits, I mean, we do see that some today. It wasn't as common back then. So it was an especially ambitious young singer-songwriter who would undertake those responsibilities at an early age. If you think of most of the people that were popular at that time, they were singing other people's stuff, and they were good songs, and many of those songs are still around. But to be a singer-songwriter when you're that young, it took a lot of confidence and perhaps ambition. So one thing about Buddy Holly, he was full of fire and determined to succeed. He ends up through, I guess, failure of any alternatives. He's known in Lubbock as this performer, his band, not a great band, but they were good, very good. So here he is in high school. He must have been, if I do the math, he must have been like a junior. Elvis Presley comes to town, and they need a warm-up band. So Buddy Holly gets the chance. Now remember, Elvis at this stage is not doing stadiums. This is a time when Elvis is just emerging, but he's catching fire. And so he had an eager student in Buddy Holly watching his performance at that time and during that entire show. So Buddy Holly just soaked it up. And he was at, of course, this age and of this mindset to where he was retentive and hungry to learn. And he happened to be around somebody like Elvis, who was, I think we can all say, I don't know any performer who was better, that readily comes to mind as being better in popular music in the latter part of the 20th century, just performer alone. So anyway, he gets schooling during this performance. He gets time to visit some with Elvis, not a lot. You know, these trips for Elvis. He is on a fast tour. The Colonel had him traveling, but there was an opportunity for him to develop some ideas in terms of performance. I don't know where he learned to write to be able to put together songs the way he did, but when you look at some of his songs, some are pretty simple and just sheer entertainment. Others are more thoughtful and substantive. True Love Ways is far and away my favorite song by him. As a matter of fact, True Love Ways is I would probably put it in my top 25, maybe 30. It's hard to, all the songs that we all listen to and like. But I would have to put it maybe in my top 30 songs, and that may sound like not much of a compliment, but it actually is when you think of all the songs that all of us like. I mean, there are hundreds of songs that we have liked at some point in our lives, most people. So Buddy, he immediately decides that he wants to make his career in music. He didn't really seriously consider college. His parents wanted him to go to college. He was raised in a Baptist home, kind of a strict Baptist home, and his father and mother disapproved of the music that he was singing at the time. And while that seems prudish to us here in the 21st century, you got to cut them some slack, because this was really radical things that were going on with young people in the latter half of the 50s, the 1950s, and parents who were thinking, oh my God, this is only going to lead to destruction. You got to cut them the slack. The world hadn't quite seen that type of music as it was coming, and it would get much worse. These same parents that were shocked in the late 50s would have just been speechless had they lived in the 70s, and some later, I guess, became anesthetized, by this progressive exposure.
But it'd be like us, parents now, their kids wanting to become a YouTuber or be a DJ or something.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's got much worse. I mean, rap and the types of things that we call quote unquote music now, it's just changed. The definition has broadened. Some of us are cynical whether the definition should be that broad, but it is. So yeah, today we're shocked, but I would argue that we're less shocked today because we have been desensitized to change. It's almost like this inflection of a curve, and we've become desensitized to the pace of change, and we almost take it for granted in pretty much every aspect of our lives today. But not so in the 50s. Things had been largely the same in important social and moral ways from the 30s, 40s, and going into the 50s. And then the latter half of the 50s, some would say that's when the wheels started coming off the bus, so to speak, of American greatness. But some of those changes were good. So his parents were not happy with this situation. They wanted him to go to college. They had hoped he would. But he stuck with this course. He formed a group called the Crickets and performed, got more and more gigs, especially after he could have a calling card which said that he had played with Elvis. So eventually this opportunity comes along for him to tour in what's called the Winter Dance Party. So as Buddy Holly was traveling about performing, word spread. There were talent scouts from the record companies who were traveling about looking at these relatively unknown performers, all looking for future stars, a future Elvis or a Jerry Lee Lewis at the time. Who else was big? Little Richard. So they were looking for these people who were undiscovered. And so they came across very early on when he was performing in Nebraska area. They came across Buddy Holly. and this record company was Decca. And Decca originally signed him for a year. You should know that he changed a couple times, recording companies. Later, I'm pretty sure MCA ended up with the rights to publish much of his work. But early on, Decca took him on. He records an album. The album is starting to sell quickly. He has these 7 hits over the course of this 2-year period between 57 and his death in 59. And then he had an album that had just been released just months before he passed away, and that was, of course, going to become more successful than it perhaps would have been simply because of his death, but also because it's just great stuff and great content. So Buddy Holly found success very early. And to his credit, he seemed to be very level-headed about managing his career. You don't hear anything about a drug problem. You don't hear anything about an alcohol problem. I don't even know if he drank. I assume he did, but you don't read about those problems. He was just a man on fire. I mean, the more you read about him, you see that he was just determined to make a name for himself. So now we need to introduce the fact that he met a woman that he married 6 months before he died. And this woman is Maria Elena Santiago. And he meets her as a receptionist, I guess, in Manhattan, where she's working at a record company. He's there in town. He's to meet with the executives. He comes in. He and a couple other of his band come into the reception area. He's visiting with this young woman, and he becomes infatuated with her, asks her out. She initially refuses because she's forbidden to. She'd lose her job, and at the time, jobs were very important. He still persists. He goes through his manager to contact her manager, and her manager tells her it's okay. So he wants to take her out to dinner that night. And the story goes, and it's true, she confirms this in an interview, that he asked her to marry him on this first date. So whatever it is he saw in her, he was sold. So she thought he was kidding. She thought it was a joke. And he said, no, I'll come to your house tomorrow and I'll formally ask your aunt. She was living with her aunt in the care of her aunt. She was, I'm guessing, about the same age as Buddy at the time. So sure enough, that's what he does. He shows up at 9 o'clock the next morning. The aunt, too, thinks it's a joke. But after his protestations of his affection and all that, then everyone's persuaded. I'm sure his parents did not approve of this. There are a number of things about him, as we've discussed, they were not in line with at this stage. And I'm pretty sure, I suspect that this is one of them. One thing that you wonder whether it was a factor was the fact that she was Puerto Rican. We don't think of anything about that today, but if you're from Lubbock, Texas in 1950, in the latter 50s, that might have been a factor, marrying somebody who is Hispanic or Spanish. I think she's actually Spanish. By that I mean, I think her family had immigrated not much before to Puerto Rico from Spain. But anyway, so she's on board. She consents, says yes. They're married weeks later. So here we are in the fall of 58. They're married. She travels some with him, so they do have some time together, but she wasn't with him on the last tour, that winter party tour, as it was called. That was something that started in early January, and it went up until his plane crash, which was February 3rd. So though the tour, this winter party tour went on, it went on without 3 of its biggest stars. So more on that in just a second. So they're married. She becomes pregnant. And this is a time when, Buddy is distracted. He's traveling, but he's delighted with the fact that he has a child on the way. So, back then it was especially important that you that you not do strenuous things. Nowadays, I think doctors realize that children or pregnancies are not quite as fragile as they were regarded at the time. But so she was encouraged to not travel, to be not moving about a lot, etc. So she stays in their apartment in Manhattan which this apartment was something they acquired immediately after they became married. And then Buddy is busy developing his career, writing songs, doing recording. So let's go to his death. So Buddy Holly was performing in Iowa, in Mason City, for anybody who might know where that is. And it was a bad night, a blizzard, et cetera. He was there with Ritchie, who was it? The Big
Valens.
Bopper.
Yep, Big Bopper, Ritchie
The Big
Valens.
Bopper and Ritchie Valens. So these were the three headers on this tour. So but lots of people turned out, big crowd, but not huge venues at the time. And they were on a tough schedule. They would spend one night in a place, perform, travel, and then often sleep simply on the bus traveling. And the bus was not heated. So while Buddy often did take the bus and not fly, he was starting to take the money and say, look, it's worth it to go ahead and hire a plane and get somebody to fly us from point A to point B, and I'll get more rest and I won't freeze to death in this bus. Now these were blizzard conditions at this time. So apparently the Civil Aeronautics Board that talked about the crash, their position was that, yeah, we knew there was snow at the time, but there was not blizzard conditions, so it wasn't an instruments only requirement. So somebody who didn't have the ability to fly on instruments alone, that would be okay. So the pilot that he chose was somebody who was 21 years old, or at least this is the pilot that was provided when he made arrangements for this plane. So this 21-year-old pilot, I'm confident, was not capable of flying without visual aids. And what the Civil Aeronautics Board concluded was that after they took off, while you could fly based on visuals at the time they took off, after they had been up for a while and their destination maybe was Nebraska, but it doesn't matter. It was a couple-hour flight or less. After they were off, not long after, the pilot became disoriented and couldn't read the altimeter correctly, was part of the conclusions by the investigation. And they felt that, without his more experience and without the ability to rely more on instruments, that he simply could not look outside and tell anything, and then that made him have to rely on the altimeter especially, which they think that he misinterpreted or simply didn't believe. And so they end up crashing. They all die immediately. One thing that was especially bad about this, in addition to what I've just said, is that at the time there was no ban on making announcements to the press about deaths and for the press to turn around immediately and publish it. So there was this race to print, race to broadcast, whether it's radio or at that time television too. So that was just something that journalistic standards had not developed around the importance of communicating with family first. So this really, more than anything else, was the incident that triggered a policy that exists now throughout America regarding notification of family first, and that the press will cooperate to assure that they don't prematurely publish this information. Now, of course, we have new forms of media now, so I'm sure there's not the same level of controls today, given that you have an internet with YouTube and X and all these other means of communication. So I don't know how you nail it down today.
Well, we had the same scenario when we talked about Kobe Bryant recently too, which that was the same situation, plane crash, and the family learned about it from information spread social media. So I guess this important step that took place with legacy media, maybe now we've got to develop something entirely new given where we are. But at that time, this was a very important step forward. So the reason that this became an issue was that media immediately, particularly with three stars, and especially Buddy was the biggest among the three. Once the media found out about this crash, they immediately rushed to publish the information. So it was even being aired on television as well as radio, and in this plane in 1,000 pieces in a cornfield. so it was kind of a shocking sight if your loved one was on that plane. And this information arrived first in that form, both to the parents. Both of his parents were alive, and worst of all, to his widow, his now widow, and she was pregnant. Keep in mind, so she hears about this. So if you step into her shoes, probably more so even than the parents, is that she was passionately crazy about this guy. They are at the earliest stages of what she was confident was going to be this wonderful life ahead, whether it would have been or not. But looking at her state of mind, and now she has a child and all the more dependent on this person, and she's watching television and finds out that he's dead. So she was, it was this huge emotional event for her where it was so bad that she had a miscarriage the next day, or less than 16 hours later, she had a miscarriage. She was hospitalized, and it was bad, and clearly the result of the way this news was delivered. I'm sure she would have taken it badly anyway, but still, it was just one of the things in reading the story. I'm thinking, this is horrible the way this went down. So she was in such a condition, quite frankly, that she didn't come to his funeral, which I don't know how many days it was later, but she was just a mess and just devastated. Since then, one good thing that's come of this is thereafter, press agreed that they would wait until official notifications. Okay, so now we've covered Buddy Holly's fame, his talent. We've talked about a biographical sketch, and now we've covered his death. So now let's start looking at his estate, his heirs, what were the assets in his estate, and what course did those values take thereafter. In order to do that, we need to break this into two parts. So we'll conclude this episode of Life's Third Act, and then we'll pick up with the rest of the story in the next episode. So I hope that you'll join us. This has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Till next time, take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement, sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.